The fight ended in an instant, and Frank couldn't withstand Gislin's overwhelming power. After all three cores detonated, in a single decisive motion, Gislin's sword pierced through Frank's abdomen, right where the core was said to exist. And in that moment, Frank felt his mana begin to dissipate uncontrollably. He realized something was terribly wrong, because even though the core wasn't a physical object, there were ways to destroy it, and Gislin was doing exactly that. Without hesitation, Gislin forced his mana into Frank's body and directly collided with his core. It was an insane method, one that risked killing both of them if it went wrong. Yet Gislin showed no concern at all. The violent clash of mana shook Frank from within as his screams echoed in terror, and within seconds the energy he had accumulated over his entire life began to collapse. Then, with a final crack, his core shattered completely, leaving him powerless as he fell to the ground. Even then, Gislin didn't finish him. After ensuring Elena was safe by knocking her unconscious and placing her away from the scene, he returned to Frank with something far darker in mind. This was no longer about battle or information. This was about revenge. With chilling calmness, Gislin began to carry out his punishment, as if it were something he had long prepared for, something he had practiced. To him, revenge wasn't meaningless. It was the only thing that could quiet the rage buried deep inside him. Frank, unable to understand Gislin's words or the madness behind his eyes, could only feel fear. Those eyes weren't normal. They belonged to someone who had killed countless times before. And as Gislin continued speaking about the past, about anger, and about wiping out every enemy, Frank realized too late that he had provoked something far beyond his understanding. By the time it ended, Frank was no longer alive. Standing over the mangled corpse, Gislin let out a quiet breath, feeling as if a heavy weight inside him had finally eased. One piece of the burning past that haunted him had been extinguished, though many still remained. But the cost of that moment was clear. His body, unable to handle the strain of detonating all three cores, finally gave in, and he coughed up blood as pain surged through him. Even so, he forced himself forward. Inside the abandoned house, Gislin discovered the truth hidden in sacks. The corpse of Gilmore Diggold, the man who had been blamed for Elena's death in his previous life. It was all a setup, a calculated move to spark war between territories. This time, Gislin understood everything, and he refused to let history repeat itself. He destroyed every trace, crushing identifying items and burning all the bodies together until nothing remained. To anyone who might find the remains, it would look like nothing more than a meaningless accident. The war that once began here had been stopped before it could even start. With Elena on his back, Gislin returned to the castle, but instead of recognition, rumors spread quickly. No one believed the truth, dismissing everything as lies and mocking both him and Elena. To them, Gislin was still the same useless noble, and perhaps that misunderstanding worked in his favor. Because while everyone doubted him, Gislin was already thinking ahead. The enemy's plan had failed, but they would not stop. If he wanted to protect everything this time, he needed more than strength. He needed power, and power required money. But right now, he had none. As he sat alone, deep in thought and searching for a solution, a loud, mocking voice suddenly broke the silence. Someone approached with laughter, ridiculing him without restraint, and upon hearing it, Gislin slowly lifted his head. For the first time since returning, he looked genuinely surprised. Kane Rogues, the heir of Rogues County and Ghislaine's cousin, had always been someone who stood above him. Strong, confident, and admired, Kane carried himself like a natural leader. But to Gislin, he was both the only friend he once had and the one who humiliated him the most. In the past, Kane treated him like a subordinate, ordering him around, taking his money, and even raising his fist whenever he felt like it. Unable to fight back, Gislin had swallowed that humiliation and vented his anger on those weaker than himself. And now, thinking back on it, all he felt was embarrassment. As Kane stood there mocking him, like always, those memories returned, but this time they brought clarity instead of anger. Kane expected the same reaction as before: silence, submission, fear. But Gislin simply stood still, staring at him with a blank expression. That only made Kane more irritated, his voice growing louder as he hurled insults without restraint. People nearby began to gather, whispering among themselves as the tension slowly built. Yet Gislin remained unmoved, as if none of it mattered. For a brief moment, he tried to hold himself back, telling himself that he had already outgrown this childish behavior and that there was no need to respond to such provocation. But the insults continued sharper and louder until finally the restraint snapped. Before he could even think, his body reacted and his fist shot forward, landing cleanly on Kane's face. The impact caught him completely off guard, and before he could recover, another strike followed, leaving him staggering as his knights rushed to support him. Humiliation spread across Kane's face, quickly turning into rage. He drew his sword, ready to strike, but his knights immediately stopped him, reminding him of the many eyes watching. Realizing he couldn't act recklessly in front of everyone, Kane clenched his teeth and chose another path. With fury in his voice, he challenged Gislin to a duel, accusing him of spreading lies and tarnishing the dignity of the nobility, turning the situation into something public and unavoidable. Gislin, however, didn't react the way Kane expected. Instead, he looked almost surprised, as if the idea itself amused him. It had been a long time since anyone had challenged him like this, and in his previous life, even the strongest warriors approached him with caution. Yet now someone like Kane stood before him, demanding a duel with complete confidence. Rather than anger, Gislin felt a strange sense of amusement, realizing that perhaps he had been overthinking everything since returning to the past. Without hesitation, he accepted the duel and tossed his glove back, making his answer clear. But just as the moment settled, Gislin suddenly remembered something else: money. With complete seriousness, he brought up the debt Kane owed him, speaking as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Kane immediately denied it, calling it friendship fees and laughing it off, unable to believe what he was hearing. Gislin didn't argue. He simply smiled because to him this duel was no longer just about pride or anger. It had become something far simpler. It was about collecting what was his. As he raised his fist again, his expression turned calm yet cold, making it clear that once the duel ended, Kane would pay, no matter what it took. Kane gritted his teeth at Gislin's provocation, his pride burning as he threatened him openly, promising to make him grovel. The two moved toward the training grounds, and word of the duel spread quickly. People gathered in excitement, eager to witness what they believed would be Gislin's humiliation. Even off-duty knights arrived, treating it like entertainment, and among them, Gislin noticed Skoven, the drunken knight no one believed anymore. Once proud, now reduced to a laughingstock, Skoven had lost his honor because he had spoken the truth about Gislin's strength, and seeing him like that stirred a quiet pity within Gislin. As the crowd grew, bets were placed, and unsurprisingly, every single one favored Kane. To them, the outcome was obvious. Just as the betting was about to proceed, Skoven stepped forward, throwing everything he had onto Gislin without hesitation, his bloodshot eyes filled with stubborn belief. Soon after, Elena entered and placed her own bet with calm confidence, choosing her brother without doubt. Both of them, treated as liars by everyone else, shared a silent understanding as they took their places, trusting Gislin despite the ridicule surrounding them. When the duel finally began, Gislin moved first with casual ease, swinging his sword lightly before pointing it at Kane, almost as if inviting him. Kane, already enraged, charged forward with brute force, his larger build making the clash look overwhelming. Their swords collided with a loud impact, and Kane poured all his strength into his strikes, determined to crush Gislin quickly. But something was wrong. No matter how hard he swung, Gislin blocked and dodged effortlessly, his movements smooth and controlled, completely different from before. As the exchange continued, the crowd began to murmur in surprise. Gislin's skill was undeniable, and even Kane couldn't hide his shock as he failed to land a single proper hit. Frustration built rapidly, his pride crumbling with every missed strike, while Gislin calmly observed him, analyzing his strength and swordsmanship with almost casual interest. Then, without warning, Gislin stepped back, smiled, and did something no one expected. He sheathed his sword. The entire crowd froze in confusion as Ghislain declared he would continue the duel barehanded, claiming the difference in their levels was too obvious. It was a blatant provocation, and Kane's face flushed with rage. But Ghislain didn't stop there. He turned to the audience, raising his hands and drawing them into the moment, turning the duel into a spectacle. With bold confidence, he even promised food and drinks if he won, igniting cheers from the crowd. What was once a formal duel had turned into something completely different. The tension shifted, and the crowd, once mocking, began to cheer for Ghislain. Kane, on the other hand, felt the humiliation intensify as he stood there, no longer the center of admiration, but a figure of ridicule. Unable to endure it any longer, Kane charged again, shouting in fury, but Ghislain moved faster. In an instant, his hand struck Kane's head, catching him off guard. Before Kane could react, more blows followed, each one precise and overwhelming. He couldn't counter, couldn't even speak properly as strike after strike landed, his body unable to keep up. The spectators watched in awe. Ghislain's movements were fluid yet powerful, graceful yet violent, a display far beyond what anyone expected. Even the knights present were stunned, unable to believe that someone of his age could move with such mastery. As the crowd erupted into cheers, Ghislain knew the moment had come. He stepped forward looking at Kane's battered figure and spoke calmly, almost kindly, telling him to brace himself. Then his fist drove into Kane's stomach with explosive force, the impact echoing like thunder. Kane's body was sent flying across the training ground, crashing into the wall with such power that cracks formed upon impact. Silence fell for a brief moment before the crowd exploded into cheers, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. But for Ghislain, it wasn't over. As he approached Kane's fallen body, the latter struggled to speak, trying to surrender, his voice weak and broken. Ghislain leaned in as if to listen, but before the words could fully leave Kane's mouth, his fist struck again, silencing him completely. Kane clutched his mouth and rolled across the ground, unable to comprehend what was happening as pain overwhelmed him. His thoughts spiraled in confusion, trying to understand how Ghislain had suddenly become this strong. It made no sense to him. If Ghislain had always been like this, there was no way Kane would have dominated him all this time. But before he could even process it further, Ghislain's relentless assault continued without pause. Each strike landed heavily, echoing across the training grounds as the atmosphere slowly began to change. What had started as excitement and admiration from the crowd turned into unease. The onlookers, who had come expecting entertainment, now watched with growing concern as the beating became increasingly brutal. Murmurs spread among them, some questioning whether it had gone too far, others wondering if someone should intervene. Kane struggled desperately, barely managing to form words as he begged for it to stop. But Ghislain showed no intention of holding back. Once he began, he never stopped halfway. It was a principle he had lived by since his days as a mercenary, where showing mercy to someone who bared their fangs could cost everything. To him, this was not excessive. It was necessary. Unable to watch any longer, Kane's bodyguard stepped forward and tried to intervene, placing himself between the two. But in the blink of an eye, Ghislain's sword was already at his throat, drawn so fast that no one noticed when it happened. With a chilling smile, Ghislain questioned whether he intended to interfere in a duel and take his master's place. The bodyguard froze, realizing the danger instantly. A duel was only sacred when it benefited those watching, and he knew that if the situation were reversed, no one would have stepped in to save Ghislain. Swallowing his fear, the bodyguard carefully suggested ending the match, pointing out that the outcome had already been decided. Kane was no longer a threat, writhing helplessly on the ground. After a brief glance, Ghislain clicked his tongue in disappointment, remarking how weak he seemed, before finally deciding to stop. But even then, he didn't let it end simply. Turning coldly, Ghislain demanded repayment for the money Kane had taken. The bodyguard, caught off guard, tried to explain that he didn't have the amount on hand and would need time to arrange it. Ghislain pressed further, forcing a clear deadline, and when the bodyguard reluctantly agreed, he added another condition, that they would also treat everyone present to food and drinks, separate from the debt. Though it was clearly unfair, The bodyguard had no choice but to accept. Arguing further could have pushed Ghislaine to continue, and that risk was far too great. With the matter settled, Ghislaine grabbed Cain by the collar. Cain, barely conscious, muttered weakly, begging to be spared. But Ghislaine only laughed, assuring him that he wouldn't be killed. After all, a man couldn't die before repaying his debt. Calling it a lesson, he ordered the bodyguard to take him away. As Cain was carried off, the tension that had gripped the crowd finally broke. Cheers erupted from every corner of the training ground. The same people who had doubted Ghislaine were now praising him, amazed by his strength and satisfied by Cain's defeat. Even the knights who had mocked Scobin earlier exchanged looks, realizing that what he had said had been true all along. Scobin, sitting with a smug grin, raised his bottle, while Elena watched with relief and pride, her earlier frustration finally easing. Ghislaine, walking back toward the castle, waved casually at the crowd, meeting Scobin's gaze and returning the gesture with a grin. Elena quickly caught up to him, linking her arm with his as she spoke with renewed excitement, her mood completely transformed. Curious and hopeful, she asked what he planned to do with the money he had won. Ghislaine laughed lightly, trying to brush it off, but she pressed on, guessing that he intended to buy a gift for his fiancée. At the mention of Amelia, Ghislaine paused. That name stirred something important. Memories of the future surfaced, revealing an opportunity he had almost overlooked. If he needed money, there was a place he could get it from. His expression brightened slightly as a new idea took shape in his mind. He decided then. He would go to Raypold's estate. After sending Elena away with a small promise to lift her spirits, Ghislaine immediately began preparations. Time was limited, and he needed to act before his father returned. When he informed Belinda of his plans, she insisted on accompanying him, knowing the dangers of traveling alone. Though he initially intended to go by himself, he accepted her reasoning. As they prepared to depart, Ghislaine noticed Belinda's hidden weapons beneath her robe, and realized once again that she was far more capable than she appeared. In his past life, he might have ignored such details, but now he understood better. With everything ready, Ghislaine, Belinda, and a small group of knights left the castle, heading toward Raypold's territory. On the way to Raypold, Belinda asked whether he was truly planning to meet Amelia without even bringing a proper gift. But Ghislaine answered casually that a simple flower would be enough. To him, there was no need to impress her anymore. In his previous life, he had once tried desperately to win her favor, but now, knowing the role she would play in the future, he felt nothing. If anything, he only saw her as someone he needed to deal with before she became a real threat. As the journey continued, Ghislaine's thoughts turned serious. He understood better than anyone that strength alone meant nothing without money. War required endless resources, and without financial support, even the strongest army would collapse. He had experienced that failure before, watching everything fall apart despite his power. This time, he refused to repeat that mistake. If there was no way to earn money quickly, then he would simply take it from those who had it. When they finally arrived at Raypold Castle, Belinda once again pointed out his disheveled appearance. But Ghislaine didn't care. Even so, he stopped briefly to pick up a bouquet from the marketplace before heading to the entrance. The guards, not recognizing him in his current state, tried to stop him, but Belinda stepped forward and handled the situation with authority, revealing his identity. Though the guards hesitated, they eventually went inside to inform Amelia. At first, Amelia refused to meet him, sending word that she was unwell, but Ghislaine simply had the guard deliver a quiet message about the Merchant Guild. That single phrase was enough to change everything. Moments later, the guard returned with a completely different attitude, inviting him inside without further delay. Belinda couldn't help but feel curious about what Ghislaine had said, but he only brushed it off with a playful remark. Inside, the wealth of Raypold was immediately obvious. The castle was lavishly decorated, far beyond anything in Ferdium, and Ghislaine took note of it all with quiet interest. He was left alone in the reception room, waiting for Amelia, who deliberately took her time before appearing. When she finally entered, she carried herself with elegance and arrogance, accompanied by her refined cat, both exuding an air of superiority. Ghislaine greeted her casually, even offering the bouquet as a birthday gift. But Amelia's reaction was cold. She accepted it only to throw it aside without hesitation, making her disdain clear. It was a deliberate act meant to provoke him, to test whether he would react emotionally as he once would have. But Ghislaine remained unfazed, responding lightly as if it didn't matter at all. That alone unsettled her. She tried to provoke him further, mocking his poverty and questioning his pride. But Ghislaine's response carried a subtle edge, hinting at something deeper. His words suggested he knew more than he should, and the confidence in his tone made her uneasy. This was no longer the same man she remembered. The shy, easily flustered Ghislaine was gone, replaced by someone calm, composed, and impossible to read. Realizing this, Amelia decided to stop playing around and asked him directly why he had come. Ghislaine didn't hesitate. He said he needed money. For a brief moment, Amelia was stunned. The sheer boldness of his request was absurd. Who would come all the way here, stand before her, and ask for money so openly? She mocked him immediately, questioning his pride as a noble. But Ghislaine simply waved it off, clarifying that he wasn't asking to borrow anything. He was asking her to give it. Leaning in closer, he spoke as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if it were something she should do without question. There was no hesitation, no embarrassment, only confidence. And in that moment, Amelia made her decision. This engagement had to end. Amelia was completely dumbfounded. Never in her life had anyone dared to demand money from her so openly, let alone someone like Ghislaine. The way he spoke about their relationship only made it worse, as if he had completely misunderstood his place. This time, she didn't bother hiding her anger and responded sharply, reminding him that Raypold had already provided more than enough support to Ferdium. Ghislaine, however, remained relaxed, crossing his legs as if the tension meant nothing to him. He calmly argued that Ferdium was protecting the North for the sake of the entire kingdom, and the support they received was simply part of that arrangement, not begging. His reasoning was logical, but Amelia dismissed it just as easily, pointing out that it was his father, not him, who held that responsibility. There was no justification for Ghislaine himself to demand anything. Even so, Ghislaine didn't back down. Instead, he shifted the conversation toward the future, speaking as if it were already decided. He claimed that once he inherited Ferdium, it would only be natural for the future Countess of Raypold to support him. The implication was clear, and it made Amelia's expression stiffen. It was a dangerous statement, one that should never be spoken aloud, and yet Ghislaine said it without hesitation. Trying to regain control, Amelia dismissed his words as nonsense, insisting that such a future was impossible. She reminded him that she was destined to marry into Ferdium, not inherit Raypold. But Ghislaine only smiled and pointed out the obvious truth. She had no intention of marrying him at all. That single remark left her momentarily speechless, unable to deny it outright. Seeing her reaction, Ghislaine decided not to waste any more time. He made his intentions clear once again. He didn't care about titles, engagement, or anything else. He just wanted money. Amelia rejected him firmly, claiming she didn't have that kind of wealth. But Ghislaine immediately exposed the truth by mentioning the Actium Merchant Guild. The moment he spoke that name, everything changed. Amelia's composure cracked for the first time, her expression stiffening as a flicker of killing intent passed through her eyes. That name was not supposed to be known. The guild was her greatest secret, the foundation of her hidden power, carefully built and concealed from everyone around her. And yet Ghislaine spoke of it as if it were nothing. Calm and composed, Ghislaine pressed further, offering a simple deal. 10,000 gold in exchange for silence. It was, in his words, a cheap price. He didn't need to prove anything, just the possibility of exposure was enough. Amelia understood the situation instantly. If even a rumor of her connection to the guild spread, everything she had built could collapse. Her siblings would turn against her father would abandon her, and even her allies might eliminate her to protect themselves. She was trapped. For a brief moment, she considered her options, her mind racing. Then, with a cold expression, she made her decision. If the threat couldn't be silenced with money, it would be erased entirely. With a quiet command, she ordered him to be dealt with. A hidden passage opened, and a swordsman stepped out, moving without hesitation. But Gislin showed no surprise. He had already expected this. Even as Amelia turned away, confident that it would end quickly, the sound of steel clashing echoed behind her, followed by a short, sharp scream. It wasn't Gislin's. When she turned back, the sight before her froze her in place. The man she had trusted as a hidden trump card lay dead on the ground, blood spreading across the floor. Standing above him, Gislin casually shook the blood from his sword, his expression as calm as ever. Before she could even process what had happened, the guards burst into the room, surrounding him and drawing their weapons. Amelia immediately ordered them to kill him, her voice filled with urgency. Though they hesitated, they couldn't ignore her command and began to close in. But before they could act, another presence intervened. Belinda appeared silently behind Amelia, pressing a dagger to her throat with a confident smile, while the accompanying knights blocked the exit. The situation flipped in an instant. The hunters had become the ones trapped. Gislin, completely unfazed, spoke casually as if nothing serious had happened, calling it nothing more than a disagreement. Then, stepping closer, he looked directly into Amelia's furious eyes and let out a quiet laugh. He told her plainly that things could have been simple if she had just agreed earlier, but now it was too late for that. The situation had changed, and so had the price. With a calm smile, Gislin delivered his final words. Now it was 20,000 gold. Bastet suddenly screeched and leaped at Gislin, but he casually tilted his head, letting the cat crash onto the floor. Watching it fail so miserably, he laughed lightly and told Amelia to keep it under control, adding that he had no interest in hurting animals. The cat glared at him but didn't dare attack again, and Gislin found the resemblance between it and its owner amusing. Then, as if it were nothing, he brought up her head of security, Burnoff. The comment was simple, but Amelia misunderstood it completely, thinking he was acting out of jealousy. However, that thought quickly shifted into unease. If someone like Gislin started spreading rumors about her and Bernarf, even baseless ones, it could damage her reputation beyond repair. Combined with the pressure of keeping her other secrets hidden, the situation began to feel suffocating. Trying to regain control, Amelia asked how he knew about the guild, but Gislin brushed it off casually, claiming he had only heard it through someone. His indifferent attitude made it impossible to tell how much he truly knew, which only made things worse. The uncertainty itself became the greatest threat. As she tried to push back, warning him about the consequences of his actions, something changed. A terrifying killing intent suddenly poured out from Gislin. The air itself seemed to freeze. Even the knights and Belinda felt the shift, but Amelia, standing directly before him, felt it most clearly. For a moment it felt as if her heart had stopped. Gislin's calm expression remained, but his presence had completely changed. He spoke quietly, telling her that threats weren't made with words. His tone carried the weight of someone who had lived through countless battles, someone who had killed without hesitation. Compared to that, her warnings felt insignificant. Then just as suddenly he pulled back, brushing it off as if it didn't matter, asking her again what she intended to do. Amelia closed her eyes and thought quickly. Killing him here was possible, but the consequences would be too great if it caused suspicion within the estate. She needed to remove him cleanly, without drawing attention. After a brief silence, she made her decision. She would give him the money, for now. With clear reluctance, she agreed to hand over 20,000 gold and ordered him to leave immediately. Gislin accepted without hesitation, even agreeing to the annulment as if it meant nothing to him. That only made her more certain that he had changed. Before he left, she told him he would regret this. Gislin simply replied that he was looking forward to it. From that moment, whatever connection they once had was completely severed. Even after he left, Amelia couldn't suppress her anger. Being threatened and forced to hand over such a large sum was an unbearable humiliation. But more than that, Gislin had become a dangerous variable she could no longer ignore. There was only one solution. He had to die. She called for Bernarf, and when he arrived, she explained everything. Though he tried to downplay the threat at first, he quickly understood the seriousness of the situation. Even a small leak could destroy everything they had built. Amelia pointed to a narrow valley along Gislin's return path and ordered an ambush. It was the perfect place, isolated, controlled, and ideal for eliminating him without witnesses. They wouldn't use their own knights. Instead, they would send mercenaries or assassins, ensuring no connection could be traced back to them. Bernarf agreed. As he left to prepare, his thoughts were simple. Ghislain was nothing more than an obstacle, one that needed to be removed quickly. Once this was over, everything would return to normal. The report of failure reached Harold Desmond, and his displeasure was immediate. A plan that should have been simple, turning Ferdium and Diggold against each other, had collapsed. Even after bribing knights and sending Frank, they had failed to eliminate a single target. Hearing that Ghislain might have been involved only made it more absurd in his eyes. When his subordinate tried to explain with uncertain assumptions, Harold's patience snapped. He had no use for guesses or incompetence. Without hesitation, he ordered the man to be taken away, ignoring his desperate pleas as if they meant nothing. To Harold, failure at such a level was unforgivable. Still, the situation left behind an unpleasant feeling. Ferdium was supposed to be insignificant, yet now it had become an irritation. Though his primary focus remained on Raypold and Amelia's rebellion, he decided not to ignore this anomaly. More spies would be sent. Ghislain's name, once meaningless, had now become something worth watching. Meanwhile, as Ghislain and his group left Raypold, Belinda pressed him for answers, unable to understand why he had demanded money so boldly. Ghislain brushed it off casually, calling it nothing more than collecting a debt from the past. Naturally, she didn't believe a word of it, but no matter how much she pushed, he refused to explain further. He knew there was no point. Even if he revealed the truth about the future, no one would accept it. More importantly, exposing Amelia now would only complicate things further. It was better to keep things as they were and move carefully. As they continued, Ghislain made it clear that they couldn't return immediately. Amelia would never let things end so easily. An attack was almost certain, and they needed something unexpected on their side, a wild card. That was when he mentioned a name: Jillian. Following scattered information, they searched the outskirts of Raypold until they found him. A broken man living in a crumbling house. His appearance alone was enough to disappoint everyone present. He looked like nothing more than a drunk who had lost everything, his presence dull and lifeless. But Ghislain saw something else. Ignoring the dismissive attitude, Ghislain spoke to him directly, offering help. Jillian mocked him at first, assuming it was just another noble's meaningless whim. But something in Ghislain's confidence made him hesitate. Eventually, he allowed them inside. The moment they stepped in, the truth became clear. Inside the small, filthy room lay Jillian's daughter, her body frail and covered in red spots, her condition so severe that she looked as though she were already on the verge of death. The sight alone was enough to make Belinda recoil. It was obvious this was an incurable disease, something beyond help. Now everything made sense. Jillian wasn't just broken. He had already lost hope. When Ghislain claimed he could help, Jillian reacted with anger, thinking it was a cruel joke. Even Belinda tried to stop him, warning that this was something no one could fix. But Ghislain didn't step back. He remained calm. He knew exactly what this disease was. And more than that, he knew the cure. Belinda was left speechless at Ghislain's words. The condition was unmistakable. Eternal punishment. A disease even divine power could not cure. The red blotches blooming and fading across the girl's body, the swelling wounds, the unbearable cycle of pain. It was something everyone knew as an incurable curse. Yet Ghislain dismissed it calmly, saying it was nothing more than an illness that could be treated. Belinda couldn't accept it. Divine power itself could only suppress the symptoms temporarily, and even that required resources beyond the reach of ordinary people. Jillian had already spent everything trying to save his daughter, only to be left with nothing but despair. To claim there was a cure sounded impossible. Still, Ghislain didn't waver. He insisted on treating her, saying it wasn't too late yet. To him, this wasn't some divine punishment. It was a disease he knew how to fix. Belinda tried to stop him, but once he made up his mind, there was no changing it. At that moment, Rachel's body convulsed violently as another wave of pain struck. Her screams filled the room as she writhed in agony, her body trembling uncontrollably. Jillian rushed to her side, holding her tightly as she begged for the pain to end, even pleading for death. The sight was unbearable. Even Belinda and the knights turned away, unable to watch any longer. But Ghislain didn't look away. He watched closely, waiting. Once the seizure subsided, he immediately began preparing. He wrote down a list of ingredients and handed it to Belinda, instructing her to gather everything without delay. When she saw one of the items, Fairy's Blessing, her eyes widened. It was an incredibly rare and expensive flower, something only the wealthiest could afford. But Ghislain didn't hesitate. It was essential. With no time to argue, Belinda rushed out while the others prepared what was needed. When the ingredients arrived, Ghislain began making the medicine himself, carefully following the method he remembered. Though it wasn't perfect, it was enough. When it was finished, he gently fed the purple liquid to Rachel. At first, nothing changed. The room fell into uneasy silence, disappointment creeping in. But Ghislain remained calm, telling them not to expect miracles in an instant. Then, as time passed, something began to happen. The red blotches started to fade. Slowly but unmistakably, they disappeared. Belinda stared in shock, unable to believe what she was seeing. Even divine power had never achieved this. Jillian, trembling, could barely breathe as hope surged within him once more. Ghislain simply nodded, satisfied that it was working. Though not fully cured yet, the improvement was undeniable. To confirm it, Ghislain sent for a priest. When the man arrived, he began his usual arrogant complaints, dismissing the situation as hopeless, until he saw Rachel. And then for the first time, his expression changed. He stared in disbelief, unable to understand what had been done. The priest who had been examining Rachel could no longer hide his astonishment. This was a disease that grew stronger against divine power over time, something even the temple had failed to treat. Yet now her condition had clearly improved before his very eyes. Unable to believe it, he immediately began channeling divine power into her once more. This time there was no resistance. The energy flowed into her body smoothly, as if it were being absorbed naturally. The priest trembled as he realized what this meant. Something that had never happened before was happening now. After finishing, he stood there in a daze before bursting into loud praise, calling it a miracle granted by the goddess. He continued rambling in excitement until Ghislain, clearly annoyed, ordered the knights to drag him out. Only then did the room finally grow quiet. Jillian, who had been watching everything unfold, collapsed to his knees. Tears streamed down his face as he gently held Rachel, whose expression had finally become peaceful. For the first time in years, she looked like a child at rest instead of someone enduring endless pain. When he regained his composure, he turned to Ghislain with trembling eyes and asked the question he feared most. Was it truly possible for her to be cured? Ghislain answered calmly. If she continued taking the medicine, she would fully recover within a few months. That was enough. Jillian, who had lost everything, now clung to that single truth. Then, as if remembering something, he asked what Ghislain wanted in return. He was ready to offer anything, even his life. But Ghislain only shook his head. He didn't want a slave or blind loyalty. He wanted the man Jillian used to be. Those words lingered in the air. After a long silence, Jillian picked up a dagger and cut off his long, unkempt hair. In that single act, something within him changed. His posture straightened, his presence sharpened, and the lifeless look in his eyes burned away, replaced with something fierce. The man who stood there now was completely different. The knights immediately tensed, sensing danger, but Jillian ignored them. Instead, he asked Ghislain a simple question, whether anyone else was nearby. When Ghislain answered no, Jillian moved instantly. He grabbed a harpoon, tied it to a rope, and hurled it with terrifying precision through the door. A moment later, he yanked it back, dragging in a hidden man who had been watching from outside. The room fell silent. Even Belinda and the knights were stunned, or sorry, none of them had noticed anything unusual, yet Jillian had not only detected the presence, but captured the intruder in a single move. Without hesitation, Jillian subdued the man and dragged him aside. When Ghislaine confirmed there was no need for interrogation, Jillian ended it swiftly. The dull, sickening sound that followed left no room for doubt. When he returned, his expression was calm, too calm. The knights could only stare, realizing that the broken man from before was gone. In his place stood someone dangerous, someone decisive, someone who would not hesitate. Ghislaine simply smiled. He knew exactly what kind of person Jillian was meant to become. When asked if he had made his decision, Jillian knelt without hesitation and pledged his loyalty. There was no wavering in his voice. His purpose was clear now. His daughter had been saved, and his life belonged to the one who made that possible. Satisfied, Ghislaine helped him up and assured him that Rachel would continue to receive treatment. From that moment on, Jillian was no longer a man waiting for despair. He had become something else entirely. A blade. The preparations for departure stretched longer than anyone expected, not because Jillian had many belongings, but because of the overwhelming number of weapons he refused to leave behind. The old carriage they had simply wasn't built to carry such a load, and the sight of him trying to fit everything in became almost absurd. In the end, Ghislaine stepped in and handed over money, telling him to buy a proper carriage, one sturdy enough to carry both the weapons and, more importantly, Rachel in comfort. Once everything was arranged, the final result was unsettling to behold. The carriage no longer resembled something meant for travel. It looked like a mobile armory. Weapons were fastened everywhere. Lances mounted beside the horses, blades lining the sides, crossbows and axes hanging within reach. Even Jillian himself carried enough equipment to make it seem like he was heading into a war alone. The knights could only stare in disbelief, their expressions tired. To them, this was excessive to the point of absurdity. A true warrior usually carried only what they needed, relying on skill rather than sheer quantity. But Ghislaine didn't question it. He simply nodded, as if everything about it made perfect sense. As they began their journey, Belinda rode quietly, her thoughts drifting. No matter how she tried to justify it, something about Ghislaine no longer aligned with the boy she had raised. His personality, his confidence, and especially his knowledge, it all felt too different. At first, she told herself it was growth, that his hidden talent had finally begun to show. But curing an incurable disease? That was beyond talent. For a fleeting moment, a dangerous thought crossed her mind, that perhaps something unnatural was at play. She quickly dismissed it. Despite everything, she could still recognize him. He was different, yes, but he was still Ghislaine. Shifting her thoughts, she began to think practically. The medicine he had created held immense value. The ingredients were expensive, but compared to the cost of divine healing, it could still be profitable. If handled correctly, even selling the method alone could bring in significant wealth. While she calculated possibilities, Ghislaine rode alongside Jillian, speaking casually as if they were equals rather than lord and subordinate. There was no stiffness in his tone, no display of authority. To Jillian, he didn't feel like a noble. He felt like a man. The journey continued without incident, which only made it more suspicious. As they approached the forest path marking the edge of Raypold territory, Ghislaine's senses sharpened. The terrain was ideal for an ambush. Narrow, enclosed, and difficult to trace responsibility if something happened. Quietly, he released threads of mana into the surroundings, sweeping the area for any sign of danger. Finding nothing immediately obvious, he signaled the group to move forward. They entered the path slowly, tension lingering in the air. Time passed, and nothing happened. Gradually, the knights began to relax, believing they had passed the danger. Then Belinda felt it. A faint but unmistakable killing intent brushed against her senses. Just as she was about to warn the others, Jillian had already acted. Without hesitation, he leaped onto a horse, severed the carriage reins, and fired his crossbow in one fluid motion. Bolts shot through the trees, striking hidden enemies before they could even react. The forest erupted into chaos. Figures emerged from everywhere, dropping from branches, rising from the ground, stepping out from concealment. There were dozens of them, easily 30 or more. Before the knights could even organize themselves, Jillian charged. He discarded his crossbow and drew his axes, moving with terrifying speed. One throw split a skull instantly. A lance taken from his saddle pierced through multiple enemies in a single charge, crushing them as he advanced without slowing. The knights froze, stunned by what they were witnessing. Fighting like that in such terrain, maintaining speed and precision, it defied everything they knew. But Gillian didn't stop. As he tore through the enemy ranks, the attackers shifted their focus. "Kill Ghislain!" someone shouted. Daggers flew from every direction, slicing through the air toward their target. Ghislain didn't move. Before the blades could reach him, Gillian was already there. He grabbed a massive shield from the carriage and planted himself in front of Ghislain, absorbing every strike in rapid succession. Without pause, he swung the shield outward, sending several attackers flying as if they weighed nothing. Belinda could only stare, her voice barely above a whisper, as she asked who this man truly was. This time, Ghislain answered without avoiding the question. He explained that Gillian had once been the captain of the Regressed Mercenary Corps, a master who could fight in any terrain under any condition. As Ghislain watched Gillian stand firm against the swarm of enemies, a faint smile appeared on his face. For the first time since returning to this past, he had someone he could trust to hold the line. The moment Gillian hurled the massive shield forward, it struck like a battering ram. The assassins charging in couldn't withstand the sheer force and collapsed instantly, their bodies thrown aside like broken dolls. The rest faltered, their advance breaking as hesitation crept into their movements. The leader, a middle-aged man, cursed loudly. This was nothing like the intelligence they had received. They had expected resistance, yes, but not a monster capable of wiping them out alone. Realizing retreat wasn't yet an option, he barked an order for everyone to attack at once. The assassins surged forward again, desperation replacing their earlier confidence. But Gillian met them head-on without a flicker of hesitation. He grabbed a hand axe from the carriage and charged straight into their ranks. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. Each swing of his axe split skulls cleanly. Swords raised to block, shattered along with the hands that held them. Even those who tried to evade found the blade chasing them mid-motion, as if it had a will of its own. In that chaos, Gillian moved like a predator among prey. One assassin seized a brief opening and thrust his sword forward with all his strength, aiming for Gillian's blind spot. The blade never reached its mark. Gillian caught it with his bare hand. The man froze. The sword, infused with mana, should have cut through flesh effortlessly, yet Gillian's grip held firm without so much as a scratch. Before the assassin could even process what he was seeing, the weapon shattered in Gillian's grasp, and the next instant, his skull was split apart. That was the breaking point. The remaining assassins staggered back, fear overtaking them completely. Even their leader could no longer force himself to advance. With a strained voice, he ordered a retreat, and the group scattered in all directions. Gillian didn't let them go. Mounted once more, he pursued them relentlessly. Daggers flew from his hands faster than his horse could run, cutting down fleeing enemies one after another. Only one managed to gain enough distance to escape, until Gillian hurled his axe with terrifying precision. At the exact same moment, a dagger shot forward and pierced the man's heart. The assassin collapsed instantly. Gillian turned. Belinda stood there, chin raised, her dagger retracting along a thin wire back into her sleeve. She claimed the kill without hesitation, while Gillian calmly stated his axe had struck first. Neither backed down, and for a brief moment, the tension between them was almost comical. Once the last enemy had fallen, Gillian retrieved his weapon and returned to Ghislain, bowing slightly as he reported that all threats had been eliminated. Behind him, Belinda glared with barely concealed irritation, while the escort knights exchanged awkward looks. They had come to protect Ghislain, yet hadn't even drawn their swords. The gap in ability was painfully clear. Whispers spread among them as they recalled Gillian's identity, the former captain of the Regressed Mercenary Corps. Suddenly, everything made sense. Ghislain watched silently, satisfaction evident in his expression. Even compared to the rumors he had heard in his previous life, Gillian's strength exceeded expectations. Recruiting him had been the right decision, one that had already paid off. With the battle over, Belinda began inspecting the bodies and quickly identified the attackers as members of the Wildcat Smuggling Guild, a criminal group known for dealing in smuggling, drugs, and assassination. Ghislaine took note of the name without much reaction, but internally it was added to his list. If Amelia was using such groups, then they would all eventually need to be dealt with. The journey resumed, and after 2 more days, the familiar sight of Ferdium Castle finally appeared on the horizon. For a moment, Ghislaine felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of belonging. In his previous life, when he had returned, there had been nothing left. No home, no family, no place to stand, only endless wandering and war. But now the castle still stood, unchanged. A quiet resolve formed within him. He would protect it this time, no matter what. Far away in Raypold, Amelia's fury burned just as fiercely. The failure of the assassination attempt shattered her composure completely. Her usual elegance was gone, replaced by raw anger as she lashed out at Bernarf. The humiliation of being defied, and worse, failing to eliminate Ghislaine, was something she couldn't tolerate. Despite his attempts to explain, Bernarf could only endure her wrath in silence. He knew the risks of attacking Ghislaine within his own territory, yet that reasoning meant nothing in the face of her wounded pride. In the end, she gave new orders. The Wildcat Guild was to remain ready at all times. This wasn't over. Though the attempt had failed, Bernarf remained convinced of one thing. No matter how long it took, Ghislaine would eventually fall. Because in his mind, Amelia always got what she wanted, and this time would be no different.